Affifi is currently a postdoctoral research fellow in the Faculty of Education at Simon Fraser University. He completed his PhD in August 2015 at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, OISE, here at University of Toronto. Ramsey is currently involved in research projects on bridging environment and philosophy of education, developing the implications of biosemiotics for human and interspecies pedagogy, permaculture and community development work, and critiquing the scope, promises, and ethics of genetic engineering. He is particularly attracted to interdisciplinary research that combines contemporary ecological theory, social and ethical issues, and adult non-formal education, and believes that much of his work will require working across disciplines in education, but also between environmental education and the social sciences, humanities, and the biological sciences. Ramsey Affifi.
Thank you very much. If I stand this far away from the microphone, can everybody hear me? Okay, great. I'm really excited to be doing this talk today, and I think that I was well placed because I think that what I'm going to be speaking about is absolutely within the same sort of framework as Sue's speech that preceded mine. It's just that the focus is slightly different, and I hope that maybe the audience can help figure out the interlinkages for and with me. So what I'm going to be talking about today is I'm dividing up in my mind right now 3 broad ways in which it's possible to do sort of green urban design in order to facilitate or encourage habitats for other species. And these 3 broad different approaches have a lot of different sub-groupings within them. And I mean, it's not always as simple as I'm going to be presenting it, but I think that there is some truth in what I'm presenting, or at least it's fruitful to think of things in this way because it will push us towards encountering and engaging with other species in new ways. That's my hope. So I'll be starting with an approach which I'm calling green tech approaches. Then I'll be briefly describing another approach which I'm going to be calling Uxkulian approaches. And then my third approach I'm going to be calling inactivist or transactivist approaches. And you'll get a sense of what those mean as I go on. So the first is a green tech approach to urban design. I'm not sure if this is the right word, but I'm just using the word green tech because that's what I've got for now. But what I mean by this approach is a way of addressing issues, environmental and ecological issues within a city, where the subjectivity of other species is not taken into consideration at all. So, for example, anything from creating concrete that's porous in order to improve the cycling of water, green roofs, recycling materials and reusing materials and natural building materials. It can a lot of organic agriculture. When biodiversity is treated as like an abstract category, like increasing biodiversity is beneficial because it makes your garden healthy. So there's a wide range of different approaches which I think fall under this. But the general idea is, I think, something like you're treating other organisms as sort of systems which can be modified and changed in relationship with one another in ways which sort of an objectivist approach is adequate. You don't need to think of them as beings which are encountering a world of their own, in some way. There's just, and in that way it sort of falls more closely perhaps with like a behavioristic tradition or and natural sciences more generally. And so, I mean, I think that for those reasons, it's also the approach which is most common in greening urban and design anywhere. The second approach, which I'm calling Uxkulian, I'm naming after Jakob von Uxkul, who was a German/Estonian biologist who wrote at the beginning of the 20th century and became quite popular amongst continental philosophers like Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty and other people quoted him, and he developed kind of a following. He's kind of seen now as a fringe figure in some ways because there is largely an overtaking of that tradition and the natural biology is becoming much more just a molecular sort of logic, which is foreign to what he was trying to get at. But his basic idea was that you can't really understand other species unless you develop a sense of understanding how they experience their world. Just as we see, say, for example, a certain spectrum of colors of light, which give this room whatever colors it appears to have for you. Another animal might see it a different way. Just as the flow of time for us is such that if there's a movie shooting fixed shots at 1/16th or whatever, 1/24th of a second, it appears as continuous. For another creature, it might require 48 shots per second or 12 shots per second in order for it to be continuous. So the flow of time might be different for different creatures. The way that different creatures organize causal relationships, or if they do, or whether or not things appear as objects, and all of these different aspects of the way that we sort of make sense of the world may be different for different creatures. And it's our responsibility as biologists to try to understand how organisms are constructing worlds right? And so you do that through carefully observing and engaging with another creature and seeing what they respond to and how they respond to it, and sort of building in your mind as best you can an Umwelt, which means like the way that they experience it. You're modeling an Umwelt of like how you think that they see the world. This approach is also, I think, like it's scattered across our history in different ways. Everything from scarecrows in cornfields to like those shadow decal stickers that they put on windows to prevent birds from smashing into them. There's many. I think insect repellents as opposed to pesticides, I think, is a more Uxkulian way of approaching an interaction with another species. So an urban design which is focused on that would be focused on examining the creatures that live in cities and coming to an understanding how they see their worlds, and then reconstructing the city in order that they can have more prosperous existence. If your goal is to create that prosperity for other creatures and cities. Otherwise, it can also be used instrumentally in order, to push away undesirable creatures by like creating semiotically distasteful things for them. So there's control. There's the Uxkulian approach and the green tech approach both can be used to control. One of them is sort of a physicalist way of controlling, and one of them is a semiotic way of controlling. The third approach, which I want to talk about, and I'm not saying that that any of these approaches are good or bad. I think that they can be used in different ways, and I think that probably the struggle of greening the city requires all three. I'm just creating this contrast in order to in order to show what the third approach, which is the one that which I want to get at, which I think has the most fruitful implications. So the third approach is, which I'm calling, is inactivist or transactivist. And I'm going to, I guess I'll introduce this by way of showing what I think is the biggest problem with the Uxkulian approach, because if you're paying attention to me, you probably can see that I got a little bit excited when I was talking about Uxkul, so it sounded like I was an advocate for it, which I kind of partially am, but I just don't think it goes far enough. So the problem that I think really comes in with the Uxkulian approach is that he was basing his framework on a very static conception of what an experienced world is for another creature. He was coming at it from the point of view of a very famous German philosopher named Immanuel Kant. And Immanuel Kant's goal in his first major book was to describe the necessary ways by which humans format their experience in order to have experience. So, there's regularities and patterns in the world right now that appear to you. Cause and effect and all of these things, space and time. But these things are not necessarily in the world itself, right? You can't make any statements about the world itself. All you know is that these are necessary ways in which you process or construct the world as part of your experience. And for Kant, these were necessary conditions for experience. They're not in any way contingent. This is the if you want to have experience, this is the way it's going to be, right? So it led to a very static conception. And in a way, it's because he was trying to ground another static conception, which was Newtonian physics, which was seen as eternal and infinite. This is the way the universe is and always will be. This is the way, Kant's vision. Yes, that's the way things always are and always will be, but only because that's the way that we construct it. Because that's what we're designed to construct that way. Because if we didn't design the world that way, we wouldn't be able to see it. We wouldn't be able to experience it. We wouldn't be able to act in the world. So, he came up with a very cute dozen categories, and it all worked out very quaintly, which just now from a 21st century point of view just comes across as very sort of contrived. But it had extremely profound influence, and it still does in a lot of ways, and especially in constructivist and postmodernist sorts of ways of thinking about the world, in certain areas of them at least. So what Uxkul was trying to do was he was like, yeah, I like this idea that there's necessary ways of constructing the world. And each of these organisms have their own necessary ways of constructing the world, right? So that's why he thought that modeling was possible. As long as you could go and observe an animal closely, you could come up with a definitive list of all of the different ways. How does this animal see? How does this animal hear? How does it make sense of relationships? How does it, and you could have a list which would be the interpretive framework by which that organism perceives the world and conceives it. And Kant, by doing this, and Uxkul, by following him, created a massive problem. There was this abyss between the world as it's experienced and the world itself, right? There's no actual relationship going on, because at any point, whatever you're interacting with is just the way that you're interacting with something that's you formatted, that you constructed. And it also leads to a very mechanical way of understanding the organism, right? Like, if the bird responds to the plastic decal sticker, it will always respond to it, because it's hardwired to do that. So the inactivist approach is by contrast with this, it's an evolutionary approach. It's a developmental approach. The idea is that, yes, the Uxquillians got it partially right. It is true that we do, and other organisms do, construct their experience. But they're not free to do it in any way they want, and they're not pre-wired to do it in any particular way. What they do is that there's an ongoing reciprocal relationship between the organism constructing a world through acting in the world and the world responding in one way or another. Like, the world just won't let the organism do whatever it wants, construct it in any arbitrary way it wants, right? The world either like lets that model go, or it's like that model's not going to fly, because what you in acting in this way leads to a consequence which is undesirable. It's just like, okay, I'm not going to do this, right? So there is necessarily built into experience a learning process, which means an encounter between this sort of subjectivity, which for Uxquil was imagined as a bubble, and a world. It's like there is actually a dialogue between them over time as the organism's interpreting and then responding to the effects, the consequences of that interpretation, and so on in turn, right, in this feedback loop. So, while that's going on, keep in mind here, though, the second point is that it really is a dialogue in a number of ways, because while the organism is interpreting a world, it's also acting in a world and changing that world. Like, the actual world is changing as a result, right? So there's actually there's an interpenetration between the subjectivity of the organism and how it perceives, and how the world in turn responds, and each co-inform the other through time. So what this means, I think, and I've got 5 minutes left, but is that there's a new type of conception that's needed here, because if we are constructing things in our urban spaces with the assumption that there's going to be a fixed way in which organisms are interpreting it, then we're acting in a static register, which isn't recognizing the interactionality, and the adaptive coevolution that's occurring. Organisms are going to be interpreting and reinterpreting in an ongoing way. And as they do that, they're going to be reconstructing the actual material world in which they live in. So if we want to enable a truly collaborative spirit, on the one hand, we have to design objects which can then be subsequently designed by other species. Because if we want to allow them to be interpreters of their world and to have that learning relationship which is that ongoing transaction, it means that they're going to be acting on the objects that we construct. Acting and changing them, right? And then acting on the basis of the changes that have then now been made to those objects. And they, in part, are now also co-designers if we let them be. The problem is that most of our designs are actually created in order to minimize or remove the design element of another species. We create paint which is specifically fungus resistant. We put spikes on pigeon spikes on top of roofs to prevent. We try to prevent as much as possible a collaborative relationship in designing. And in fact, we see design and being wild or being natural as opposites, when in fact all there is organisms designing their worlds, one of which is our own. So on the one hand, we have the invitation is to think about, okay, getting beyond this, creating designs which include other organisms as perceivers, getting into the Uxquillian Umwelt thing, beyond that, it's like, okay, what about what kind of design principles would have to go into creating something which actually doesn't just allow but encourages other organisms to be co-designers in the process. And the final thing is that, like, is of course that, you know, why is just the point is this also is like, if we're taking design seriously, urban design seriously, why does it always even have to be humans that are the ones setting up the whole thing, right? Can't, like, at some point we're gonna have to be like, okay, you know, what spaces are just going to be just designed by other organisms, or they're the ones taking the lead, and then we, you know, we're transacting with it as best we can, but on their own terms and whatnot. There's a whole spectrum of different ways of thinking about things that are in here. The final thing I just want to say about all of this is that this transactional approach, I think, is inherently pedagogical and educational, because as soon as we're dealing with organisms which are open-ended, indeterminate, learning through relationship, that are with the materials that they live in and with other organisms, then all of these things now are pregnant with potential pedagogical value, right? Because it's like, depending on how things are built or designed, affects how they'll be interpreted. How they'll be learned from, right? And and in turn also how the other organisms then reconstruct our designs is also now being something which is informing us and an opportunity for us to learn. So there's a way of conceiving design as being about the construction and reconstruction of teaching relationships, both between humans and other species, through a material which has its own curricula. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ramsey. If there's any other immediate questions for him, I'll open the floor for that. Sue?
Yeah, I always struggle with language schools. Like, I wonder, I like your idea that certain animals are transforming their landscapes, but then I keep going back to the you know, the sort of the tick. And I'm wondering if your vision is really focusing on a very particular set of animals or organisms in terms of this you know, aren't there some things that just respond? Or that maybe on the, when you're talking about interacting, you're really talking about evolutionary terms, really not talking about...
No, I'm talking evolutionarily, but I am also talking ontogenetically. And I don't know specifically about the tick, but I know that fruit flies studies of fruit flies have revealed that they are capable of associational learning. In fact, studies of plants have also revealed that. Bacteria, it's been revealed. And I think my opinion is that Uxtul was premature in making the assumption that ticks only have 3 things that they respond to. And in fact, that presumption is itself has pedagogical value, right? Because it makes you relate and interact and build things in certain ways, which then constrict the possibilities of learning for yourself and for the creatures that interact with it. So even from a pedagogical point of view, I think it's wise to suspend the stance which assumes that things are fixed, whether or not they are.
See one for here at the back. I'll get up to Justin.
I did some very preliminary research on the unload. Correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't there something that they call a functional circle related to the unload, where the objects do influence the animal's perception?
Yeah, well, okay, so, Uxtul got, sorry, was your finished question?
Well, I just want to know how that fits into like your third question, because if it's already built into the unload that they learn from objects, how is what you're saying differentiating from that?
Okay, so Uxtul was wise to, like, he got it right in recognizing that there is a feedback loop. He called, like, it was a functional circle, or what they call sensory motor circuit, where what you perceive then it is part of like part of your motor acts create your perceptions, and your perceptions therefore elicit or inform your motor acts, right? And there's this circuitry, so like meaning is part of act and sensing at the same time at all points, what appears as significant. That's true. He did do that. But what was available in the sensory motor circuit was fixed. And that wasn't just for ticks. He did these models for dogs as well, right? He kind of thought that humans were the only things that were able to break out of this sort of echo chamber of sorts, right? So that feedback loop wasn't in a way a real feedback loop. It was a feedback loop between a perceiving organism and a world of perception that it had constructed, as opposed to an interaction with, between a subject and something which is continually informing it in some sort of, as something transcendent, but not in a religious sense, but in a philosophical sense.
Justin?
So are you saying that our built environments are like monocultures of human design in a way most of the time?
What do you mean by monoculture in this context?
Because we're not letting other species get involved in the design of the environment. Is that like it sounded like you were advocating that we try to let other species get involved with urban design.
I am advocating that.
All right. That's really cool.
We've got time for a couple more, so we're okay here.
It's a bigger question, but I wonder if species is the best unit for making sense of this. Just clearly, London School's preoccupation, but if you look at how Deleuze takes London School, it's about processes. And I wonder how you could extend that towards a process, even something like a river or a lake. Could you think about designing with a river, or designing with a lake, or designing with the hydrological cycle to take it beyond, I guess, the familiar species ontology that we're used to?
I think it would. I like that. I think that that's the approach to take for any. The transactional approach is fruitful for any relationship, complex relationship. I think because it's like it gets beyond the sort of the static assumption that either party is fixed in some sort of a way. I think that would lead to more responsive and sensitive and attentive relationships with anything. My bigger concern with the species thing, for me personally, is that it effaces the differences between the organisms in species. I think that I think that there's, for me personally, I still hold on to. If I'm a dualist in any way, and I hate dualism in most ways, but I still hold on to somewhat of a distinction between life and non-life, and so I don't want to flatten the ontology that much. But I agree as methodologically that's an important thing to do.
So it's just trying to think of real life examples where people might have, or even implementing some of the things that you're advocating. And would a good example be like people building platforms for ospreys, where they're not actually building the ospreys a nest, but they're just making another space where the ospreys can build their own nest, and making sure that around the area there's like plant species of the correct native type where they can take the proper twigs or the proper reeds to build their own nest. Is that sort of what you're talking about, of sort of humans and animals and taking different leads and changing their own environment together?
Yeah, it's like any example where there's any sort of collaboration would do. I guess the point, so I think that would work for sure. I guess the point is that I'm making is that I think that we're in our infancy in sort of thinking, in really knowing how to think about and do this kind of work, and that, the more we sort of would take this sort of possibility seriously, then it's sort of hard to imagine what is possible. How this building could be co-designed differently as an evolutionary system which is growing in meaning through being ongoingly designed.
Just a thought, and you might not have an answer to this, but I'm totally up for or advocate and support the transactional approach that you are outlining. But what I'm thinking about is what are the challenges associated with actually making this happen as I work in the same field. And what I was thinking is, when we allow other organisms, species, to be co-designers in our structures, the challenge that I can immediately see is that not all species or not all organisms are the same. So some might be easier to incorporate than the others. So in that case, then where and how do we draw the line in terms of which are allowed to be co-designers versus some others? That comes to the basic discussion of generalist species versus some of the sensitive ones and so on. And the answer may lie in more of the societal structures and the policies and so on and so forth. So how do you think we could influence that and make, like you said, it's in the infancy, so how can we make that actually happen, and what might be the challenges associated with it? Again, it's a loaded question that probably I know, but just a thought that, how do we make it happen, because that's what we are struggling with.
Yeah, no, so about who gets included and who doesn't, these are exactly the kinds of things that we should be thinking about, I think. And, I think that that's a collective discussion, which I'm not going to be able to figure out. But I think that the problem is, in the same way that, so in educational theory, we've got this idea that comes from Freire, right, which is that there's a banking education model where the goal of education is to impart or deposit knowledge into a passive student. And he, struggled with trying to enact a vision which had the student as the discoverer and constructor of their own meaning, and breaking down the teacher-student boundary by making everyone a teacher, everyone a student, and doing that in a world which is already pre-constructed in a whole bunch of ways, not like infrastructure in terms of expectations, curricular expectations, all of this, to continually push the banking model, right? And that's kind of the same situation we're faced with, in the sense that we're thrown into a situation where there's a whole bunch of momentum pushing us towards making the project of taking other organisms' agency in the design process seriously an extremely difficult thing to do. And so I think that, at this point, we have to be experimental and open and just look for opportunities, and recognize that there is a structural difficulty at this point that also needs to be addressed.
Thanks for your talk. I was thinking not so much a question, but a comment that when thinking about cooperation and collaboration in design between non-human and human agents or actors, that the idea of the commons might be helpful if we can do this a bit more in terms of thinking about leadership roles. So one could say that in a collective there are always natural leaders, but in this case, who would be the natural leader? And that would, in terms of thinking through design like this, right? So would then the non-human actor become the leader, and the humans would then follow that path? Or so who sets the process in motion? So collaboration, I think, tends to assume that there is a natural equality between actors, right? But we know from history that that's not necessarily the case. And so a lot of issues around democracy within the commons really addresses those micro-level interactions and problems about who actually takes charge and who challenges and who leads or who doesn't lead, etc. So that might be something to think about going forward in terms of actually seeing non-human actors as being the ones who actually lead the design, and humans are then the followers as part of a collective or collaborative experiment.
I like that. I'm going to think about that and hopefully talk to you as well.
Okay.